Well, I really appreciate you joining us. You know, I know that we have been trying to put this together for a little while, and thank you to your staff and your chief of staff, Andrew Christensen, for helping get us all in the same Zoom room.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to just have a conversation today a little bit about what it's like being a member in the House of Representatives and
a freshman in the minority. No
yes.
In Nancy Pelosi's house. Here I am.
Can it get any better? You know, we have about 80 people that have pre-registered today, and a large majority of those folks are coming from outside of South Dakota. So this is kind of really their first experience with South Dakota. I was asking some of them, have they been to the state? Not many of them have, although we do have some people that live in the state and live there a long time. But can you tell us what it's like to be a South Dakotan and what has led to your journey in political office?
Well, and I would say, I mean, I moved away from the state for a little while. You know, I worked for the Department of Agriculture for a year or two outside of South Dakota. And then my wife and I moved to the Kansas City area, and we were there for a few years. So we really are South Dakotans by choice now. And when I made a list, when she and I made a list of the things that really mattered to us, it's not, you know, 100 sushi restaurants to choose from necessarily. We go clubbing less in our 40s than we never really went clubbing, but certainly we're less likely to go at mid 40s than I was at mid 20s. I don't need to see but about 2 NFL games in any given year. And so for me, what really mattered was personal responsibility, a sense of community, and those things are not opposed. They work in tandem with one another. You have a stronger community that can lift up people when they fall, if they know that those people are also going to do the best they can day in and day out to try to be self-sufficient and be responsible and be responsive. And I just think South Dakota has a lot of that. I mean, it's remarkable. I think you see from our response to COVID-19, we didn't need to have government do as much because the citizens were willing to do so much on their own, not at the end of a bayonet, but because of a sense of concern and for their fellow man, their fellow human.
You know, you're absolutely right. I was talking to a good friend of mine from Sturgis yesterday, and we're going to be coming out there in August for the rally. And for the folks who've never seen anything about the rally, you need to look it up. But we were talking a little bit, and you know, it's this sense of self-dependence, right? The sense that they are out there, they are going to lend a hand to their friends and neighbors, but they don't expect government to help them. And that's really one of the reasons I think I fell in love with South Dakota when I first came out there in 2003 and was able to help then Congressman John Thune. And you, at the time, you popped up on the radar because you were running for Public Utilities Commission.
What in the world is the Public Utilities Commission? Nobody really knows.
Exactly. And we were going around and we were knocking doors, and you know, and I remember the mugs that we would hand out in the blizzards, and it would say "Vote for Dusty," and lo and behold, he got elected. And you know, it always amazed me, and it made me kind of think, what am I doing with my life? Because here I'm a little older, a little more gray. You're younger than I, and you have not only been statewide elected, but you're now serving in the Congress. What's that been like for you?
Well, it's interesting because on one hand, I do feel young. I look maybe a little younger than mid 40s, but I feel maybe a little bit older in any given day. But South Dakota has always been willing to give young people a chance, particularly in this House seat. It's amazing. Again, I don't feel old, but in the history of this at-large congressional seat in South Dakota, I am the second oldest person to ever step into this office. I mean, Tom Daschle was in his 20s, and Tim Johnson was in his early 30s, and John Thune was in his early 30s, and Stephanie Herseth-Sandlin was in her 20s, and Kristi Noem was in her 30s. And it's remarkable the number of really young people that have been in this job. And they've all been hardworking, whether their politics were my politics or not. They all went out there every single day and really brought it. But because I've had, been a successful co-owner of a business with a couple hundred employees, and because I've been chief of staff to the governor, frankly, the mix of public and private sector experience I have had is maybe even a little bit, I think it's a little bit more advanced than maybe, Tom Daschle would have had the day he was sworn into the U.S. House. So it's interesting.
We, at the Leadership Institute, one of the things that we have done for over 41 years now is we go out and we train people how to win, how to get elected to office. Certainly, we have been out in South Dakota and done training programs, and it's always interesting.
And I sat in on some of them; they're good.
Thank you.
They're effective.
Appreciate that. It's always amazing to me. We can't say we take credit for these folks, but we like to think we help them along their journey. And when we're going out there and we train them, and then they get elected, it's always this deer in the headlights kind of when they get elected in their first day on the job, right? What was it like for you coming in as a freshman in the minority? What's been the biggest lesson you've learned? What piece of advice can you give folks out there that are stepping into a big job?
Well, the old rule of thumb in Congress is that the first 6 months you're there, you just can't, you look around at your colleagues and you just can't imagine that you're there. And that after the first 6 months, you look around at your colleagues and you can't believe that they're there, right? And I think a lot of my colleagues are very talented, but they're not more talented than the great leaders that are helping to run almost any community in this country. I mean, if you want to go to Aberdeen, South Dakota, or Watertown, South Dakota, or Spearfish, these are not massive communities by national standards. Many of the people, from across the country that you've got on this chat right now, come from communities that are that big, or maybe even smaller. And they're all run by people who care, and they're smart. And Congress is made up of a certain number of people like that. And the only reason I bring that up is that it's not as though the United States Congress is too big for normal leaders. You don't have to be Superman. I mean, Dan Crenshaw, he's the eye patch guy. I mean, his story of serving our United States military is incredible. Mark Green, another one of my freshman colleagues. Mark Green was part of the group that went and got Saddam Hussein, right? And they're impressive, but you don't have to have this made-for-TV story to go out and serve our country.
Yeah.
And I've gotten bills signed into law by the President of the United States, and I'm the ranking member on a really important subcommittee. And it's not that I'm special. I'm just like a lot of South Dakotans, and I'm like a lot of people involved in your organization. I'm just hardworking, and I give a damn.
We at the Leadership Institute, we love Dan Crenshaw. Dan had taken some of our campaign programs, and he has done webinars similar to what we're doing today. And one of the things that I am always impressed with Dan about is that he believes in loyalty. This was one of the things that I think was instilled in him through his military service. It's continued on, certainly. And for me, that's one of those things that in Congress and in politics, loyalty is so key, right? Yeah. Whether you're working with somebody on the left or the right, you want them to at least stand by their principles. And I think you have done that very well throughout your tenure in public service. So I commend you.
Well, thank you. And you can tell which members of Congress are, frankly, just which people in the universe, who's in it for themselves because they want to be something, and who's in it because they want to do something. And I have lots of frailties and lots of weaknesses, but I am mission driven. I mean, I am purpose driven. And to me, we've got a lot of good stuff we got to get done in this country, things we have to get done. And I'm excited to serve, and it's an honor to try to be a leader in that discussion.
You mentioned the corona pandemic and kind of what's going on in Congress. For our folks that are not following this as closely as they can you give a little insight into what that process has been like? What I hear the HEROES Act is coming up, and can you share with us a little bit behind the scenes?
Right. Well, we started out in a very bipartisan tenor, and I thought that was helpful. The CARES Act, that passed out of the United States Senate 96-0. And I would submit to you that when Ted Cruz and Bernie Sanders are singing from the same sheet of music, you know we're in unusual times in this country's history. And it's amazing how quickly we came together, House and Senate, Secretary Mnuchin from Treasury, the President of the United States, Vice President Pence. We got a lot of really good work done. Now, the bills weren't perfect. There were warts on every single one of them, but by and large, they hit the target. We've gotten a little bit away from that. And you mentioned the HEROES Act, Speaker Pelosi's bill. That was $3 trillion. It was the most expensive bill in the history of the United States House of Representatives. She she drafted that 1,400 pages without a single meeting involving Republicans. The Senate was not involved, Treasury was not involved, Republican House members were not involved. My concern wasn't so much that, listen, the spending is a problem, clearly, and we can talk about that later in the webinar, but even if you support that investment in COVID-19 issues, you shouldn't support the investments that the HEROES Act made. In that so many of the things that were in that bill were not tied to COVID relief. They bailed out union pensions, decisions that have been made 20 and 30 years ago. They provided massive tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires only in blue states and not in red states, only in high tax states. They rolled back protections for life. They prohibited the deportation of illegal immigrants. It provided $10,000 of student loan relief to everybody, whether they needed it or not. Now, maybe some of your people on this webinar may like one or more of those policy provisions, and that's fine. Reasonable people can disagree about those policy provisions, but we should all agree that during a time of national emergency, our emergency response bills should not be tied to decades-long priorities of the speaker. It should actually be about the disaster itself.
Right, and that seems to be, unfortunately, the trend lately, right? When there is a national disaster, whether it's a pandemic or whether it's a hurricane or flooding, we don't have these clean bills anymore. It's everyone's political priorities, and it's used as leverage and a bargaining chip. And I would think the average person out there, regardless if they are conservative, middle of the road, or liberal, if they were to know that some of these members were taking advantage of a crisis time, would be appalled by that.
Yes, I think, the real truth is sort of in a complicated spot, in that, of course, I want a bill that speaks only to my priorities. Well, the American people, for whatever it is worth, it's a frustration to me, but for whatever it's worth, they chose to put the Democrats in charge of the United States House.
Yeah.
They put Nancy Pelosi in charge of Congress. And so as long as we are in a system of divided government with the Republicans in charge of the Senate and the Democrats in charge of the House and the President Trump in charge of the White House, we are not going to be able to get a bill that only has my worldview incorporated in it. It's impossible. It's literally impossible to pass a bill, without votes from the United States House, right? Yeah. And so I am really pretty reasonable and pretty pragmatic about the idea that in a marriage, nobody gets a full loaf. Running a nonprofit, running a business, nobody gets a full loaf. Every negotiation is going to have some give and take. The problem, and this comes back to what you were mentioning, the problem is when people try to bring in tragically unrelated issues in an attempt to leverage the pain of other people. And I think, yes, by all means, let's fight, but let's fight fair.
So how do we expose this? It seems like the media is very good on their narrative of what they want, but the average person out there doesn't understand it. And it's like a child, right? They will continue to do something that you tell them not to do until they feel that there's a ramification. How do we expose what's going on in our Congress and what the left is doing?
Well, we do need more transparency, but we need more thoughtful transparency. So often you'll get a bill. So with the CARES Act, which again passed the Senate 96-0, something like the Paycheck Protection Program is broadly concerned to have had a massively beneficial impact on small business in this country. Mm-hmm. But that's not what the headlines are about. The headlines aren't about the good stuff. We get captivated by $25 million to the Kennedy Center. Now listen, I don't think that money should have been in there. I think it was a problem. It made the bill less good. I think we should all have a little bit of righteous indignation about that. And yet, it was a $2 trillion bill. And in the wake of the passage of the CARES Act, more Americans were paying attention to $25 million than they were to the $2 trillion. And so transparency is good. We need more of it, but we need more transparency with some depth and some nuance and a comprehensive look at the facts. So many of us, and I'm guilty as well, we turn on cable news, we get excited about the shiny object, and we frankly forget the even bigger issues lying behind that.
Speaking of cable news, so in South Dakota, there is a meat packing plant in Sioux Falls. That got a lot of attention during COVID. A lot of people were paying a lot of attention to the outbreak at the meat packing plant. And the full story of what was going on in South Dakota and how South Dakota really had some of the least amount of cases and how Governor Nome was doing a tremendous job at managing a crisis really wasn't discussed much. Can you give our folks a little insight into what took place in South Dakota with COVID?
Well, and particularly for the first couple months, I don't think you saw South Dakotans were compliant. Some folks would have thought, oh, South Dakota hasn't locked down, so it's just the Wild West out there. Well, listen, my church wasn't doing I don't know of any church in Mitchell, South Dakota that was doing in-person services. I don't know of any restaurant in Mitchell that just had 40 people sitting on top of one another dining out. People were doing takeout. People were doing delivery. People were cooking at home. It looked like it looked in Cleveland or Miami or Richmond or LA. People were making good decisions. When my family and I would go out for walks, people were not gathered 100 folks at a family reunion at the park. The difference is that South Dakotans did those things because it was the responsible thing to do. They took personal responsibility. And even if they weren't nervous about getting sick, they understood that part of being if we want freedom, then we also need to exercise it in a way that is responsible and respectful. And that's what South Dakota did. And the fact that we did that because it was the right thing to do during the curve flattening period, rather than telling people, under the force of law, that they no longer had that choice, the South Dakota way is better.
I would agree. Much concern has been brought up over the food supply as COVID has gone along. And you're in a state and you are a ranking member on the subcommittee in agriculture that our food supply is at constant concern. And I think it's been highlighted certainly in the last few months. What are you doing through the agriculture committee to make sure that our food supply stays secure, stays fresh, and that we're meeting the needs of our farmers and ranching community?
Sure. And I don't want to just turn this into a foreign affairs issue, but I'm going to start there. And food security is a critically important part of this, but it's broader than food security. I believe in free trade, willing buyer, willing seller, but I also believe that if you want to maintain a degree of legitimate sovereignty over your nation, there are critical parts of infrastructure that need to be at home. We should not need to ask China's permission to be able to secure critically important medical equipment and medicines. And the food supply chain is very similar to that. And so I've been a leader on a bill that would add a seat, the Secretary of Agriculture, to the Committee on Foreign Investment, CFIUS. And this is the body that has, anytime you have a large foreign entity who wants to come in and make a large purchase of American infrastructure, that is the committee that determines whether or not that is in the national interest. And there has been no voice for food security or agriculture on the Committee for Foreign Investment, the Committee on Foreign Investment, ever before. And I'm working to get that because I think it's a perspective that's critically important. We also need to build additional capacity. And our food supply system is always going to have a just-in-time component, and that's appropriate. And that has meant that the real price of food, has gone down 30% in the last 30 years. I mean, we are doing a better job than ever before of feeding the world and feeding Americans in an affordable way. But we do need enough capacity so that if you get a disruptive event, you don't see producers getting less than they really than is appropriate for beef on the hoof, at the same time that consumers in the meat case are paying more. We do want a system that can absorb some shocks.
Absolutely. Well, I think on behalf of some of the farmers and ranchers that I've known, they appreciate you advocating on their behalf, certainly. It is so important that we have a strong agricultural community. I myself was a member of the Future Farmers of America for 4 years. I know the hard work that goes in to this, and so thank you for what you're doing there. Congressman Johnson, just kind of shifting a little bit more, as you go into your reelection, you're a few months out from reelection. What are the things that you still want to see accomplished that you think you can get, even in a minority? What's some of the legislation out there that you're concerned with?
Well, this is admittedly going to be hard, but I think it is a stretch goal. I talk to more and more of my friends on the other side of the aisle about how work is not punishment, work is opportunity. And as we get into this recovery, we are, I think, in a relatively short span of time, going to get back to a point where we have more job openings than job seekers in this country. And we need to make sure we've got a policy environment that rewards work. And I don't know why we would have a 27-year-old man in Iowa who is capable of working but chooses not to be eligible for food stamps and LIHEAP and TANF and ACA and HUD. This alphabet soup of programs is, we should be helping people who are doing their best to help themselves and still falling a little short, or people who cannot help themselves. That is why we have a social safety net. And I am a believer in work requirements for able-bodied Americans, not senior citizens, not disabled, not people in super high unemployment areas, right? If there's not a job for you to go get, I don't want to punish you for that, but we need to reward work. And I believe that there are a lot of moderate Dems who understand the value of work and are willing to work with me in my position as the ranking member on that subcommittee to try to put into place some of that meaningful change.
I think that's been one of the biggest challenges with some of the relief packages that it came out of COVID, is it became more economically prosperous for somebody to take government assistance than to go back and work. And this was something that I just saw a few weeks ago when I was out traveling. These employers who wanted to open up were now allowed to open up in these small businesses, these restaurants and snack facilities said, I can't get the employees to come back. And some of the employees would tell them, I'm making more off unemployment right now than I would make coming back and working.
Yeah, it was the biggest mistake in the CARES Act by a country mile. There were a number of real freedom lovers in the Senate that tried to get that changed, but it was too late in the legislative process. It is absolutely something that we as Congress need to be duty bound to fix, because it is slowing our recovery.
And it was deliberate. I remember my wife was looking at some of the legislation and talking to her folks in the Senate, and she said, is this an accident? And they said, no, it wasn't an accident. So it's amazing to me to see that. I am excited to see that as businesses and industries start to open up, that I think we will start to see the jobs pick up. We will start to see the economy start to rebound. And I hope we can continue with that. Now, Congressman Johnson, as we have traveled the country and talked to different folks, it always amazes me that I talk to people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and they say, we need younger blood in our political parties. We need more folks that are engaged in different communities. And certainly here we are on Juneteenth Day, a day to kind of reflect on what's going on nationally. How do we become more in our party and in the conservative movement, how do we become more, I think, in tune with people who may be younger and expand the party and expand the conservative movement?
Well, and I want to make it very clear, I'm not talking about changing our views. I'm a conservative. I believe in the Republican Party platform. I think it is the right way to craft our nation and, frankly, to deliver opportunity to all people. But our tone and our language is not particularly conducive to making converts. And I want to make it clear. I want us to remain the party of conservative values. But so often we are talking about these issues in a way that maybe appeals to 65-year-old men as opposed to 17-year-olds. And I've spent a tremendous amount of my life trying to build a young party. For 10 or 12 years, I was the state advisor for the Teenage Republicans. And I saw Monty on earlier, and Monty spent a lot of time helping out with college Republicans. And that is building the bench for the future. But language does have an impact. And frankly, young people are growing up with less of an appetite for zero-sum game adversarial wording. And so when we talk about the Democrats and attack them personally, that turns off young people. They're far more comfortable when we attack the ideas of the left than when we attack the people of the left. And the nice thing about attacking the ideas is that it's got long-term value. If you're attacking the ideas, then the personalities on the left can change, but your arguments don't. You're still talking about freedom. You're talking about liberty. You're talking about economic opportunity. You don't need to come up with a new game plan because the villain has changed. And so I think this is largely a messaging issue. And if we want to continue to have an important role in governing this country as a conservative body, as Republicans, we've got to find better words.
You're absolutely correct. I think back to this argument of socialism, right? We are attacking individuals, whether it be AOC or Bernie or things like that. But the socialist, the crimes of socialism have been in place for decades, if not longer. And you're right, we should be attacking the ideas because we have history on our side, right? I'm amazed when I look at the Gen Xers and Gen Yers. They are the most entrepreneur-focused generations that
they have
we've
an energy.
seen. I'm sorry?
They have an energy, an excitement.
Yeah. They want to, develop, they want to contribute to society, and they want this idea of freedom and liberty. And so when you go and say, hey, we have time on our side, we can show you how this works and successful, that is a winning argument. You are 100% correct.
Yeah, we are the strongest party when we talk about ideas rather than people.
We've got a few more minutes here, and I wanted to give our audience just a chance to chime in. I know that there's been some questions popping up as I looked into the chat. Would you mind taking a few more minutes just for the Q&A from our audience?
Oh, I'm as happy as a pig in slop. Let's keep doing it.
Excellent, excellent. Well, folks, if you haven't had a chance to type in your question, I would ask that you would put that into the chat room right now. But I'm going to pop into our Q&A section real quick here and see if I can find couple different questions that our audience has had. Here is a good one. Barbara writes, will healthcare and healthcare transparency be on the agenda in Congress this year? And if so, is there a way to protect companies that offer too low to be safe options?
If there's a chance to help companies that do what?
A way to protect against companies that offer too low to be safe options. I think she's asking if the companies are not compliant and not offering good enough health care.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, clearly with Obamacare, it has been a failed experiment. I don't see a lot of passion. I mean, maybe there's passion, but I don't really see a way forward in the remainder of this Congress to tackle the pretty substantial gaping holes in our current healthcare payment system. And, in my mind, we are clearly, there needs to be some subsidy for sick people, right? We're just not going to say, well, listen, it's, actuarially, you got to pay $2 million a year, sick person, for your insurance. And if you can't afford it, screw you. That's not where we're at. And I think people in my party have been painted with a lot of very callous colors with the idea that we don't care about people with pre-existing conditions. We don't care about sick people. Baloney. That's total balderdash. So the question comes down, what is the right way to subsidize sick people? And what is, and the way we're doing it right now, which is to a substantial extent through premiums, makes it more expensive for the rest of the pool to afford insurance, which means more and more people get out of the pool, which means you get this death spiral. As we've seen, rates going up and up and up, more and more people getting out, and it doesn't work. But just politically, I don't know what possible healthcare compromise at a comprehensive level you could put together that Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi could agree on.
I think one of the responses in the chat room mentioned transparency, And I found it interesting that the president had mentioned this idea of healthcare providers and their billing transparency, being able to show that, if I go to the doctor down the block and I want a heart procedure, it's going to cost me, $5,000. And if I go, to 2 miles away, that doctor is going to charge me $10,000. The transparency in the billing of healthcare, I think, is the biggest thing that we can do going into processes, right?
Well, I would say two things. Number one, some states have mandated that, and it's got a relatively limited impact, in part because so much of the payer mix is away from the decision maker. So yeah, maybe I can save $2,000 on a knee if I go here rather than there, but I like this place better. This is better. I think the outcomes are better whether they are or not. I'm only paying 10% of the $2,000. So, that transparency, while clearly I'm for it, I think we would make an error if we acted as though it were a panacea. The other thing I would say, I'm going to claw back my answer from earlier. I would tell you, I think there is room for improvement on pharmaceutical pricing. The president has been very aggressive on this front. And although I don't agree with everything the president's trying to do, I've introduced H.R. 19 along with 100 colleagues of mine in the Republican side of the House. And H.R. 19 would do a lot to stop abuse. I mean, right now, companies can do in the pharmaceutical industry, which they can't do in any other industry, which is pay their competitors to stay away. In most industries, that would be collusion. Here, it's not. That you've got a generic you're ready to bring to market. I can pay you, pay for delay mechanism. And it really has an impact, a negative impact on prices, keeping them higher, even outside the patent protection period. And the Republicans have come forward, and we're looking for common sense reform. We're looking for a maximum out-of-pocket limit on Medicare Part D, which I think would help to have a more equitable approach toward paying for some of these pharmaceuticals. We are getting taken advantage of. Our country, the United States of America, is paying for almost all of the profit and almost all of the R&D for pharmaceutical companies because the rest of the world is not carrying their fair share. And in the same way that the president is trying to make NATO countries step up and do their fair share, we need to demand more from the free riders. And I think that is an area where you can see some congressional agreement.
Excellent, excellent. Well, for all our friends in the room right now that are activists and are wondering what bills they can get behind, the Leadership Institute is a 501c3. We do not support or endorse legislation, but certainly in your free time, folks, I encourage you to find out what those good bills are and those bad bills, and to help take action against whatever the left is throwing out there. I got a question.
19. HR 19. Look it up.
Thank you. We got a question from one of our youngest members in the chat. We have a 16-year-old Petra Johnson. She's from New Jersey. And Petra was saying that her area of the country, particularly her county, is extremely liberal, and wondering what can be done to fight the liberal onslaught, liberal indoctrination that's being pushed in their communities.
Well, we're certainly swimming upstream. I'm an optimist, so I'll give you an optimistic answer. But I don't, by and large, I don't think it is pulling back or entrenching into an enclave. I think I see a lot more of that from my conservative friends. They're concerned about the negative influences of the broader world, and so they just sort of want to pull back to an area that's a little more comfortable. And it's really hard to make converts when you're only talking to the converted. And so I know it's hard for you to be in that battleground. I know it's hard for you to be in a place where so few people agree with you, Petra, but you are doing really good work. And I would read, I would listen to podcasts, even if there are conservative thinkers within the conservative sphere that you don't quite agree with. Maybe you don't like Ben Shapiro's idea on X, but I think listening to somebody like Ben Shapiro that can take a logical approach will help you be better at talking the talk to people who are open to being persuaded. So listen to a wide variety of thinkers, a wide variety of conservative voices, and then talk in a non-judgmental way to your cohort that are open to being persuaded. Use language of inclusion. Talk to them about Ronald Reagan. This is a guy who built an abiding conservative coalition because Ronald Reagan used the language of opportunity and optimism rather than the negative language of hate and division. I think when politics is about addition and multiplication, our party wins. When it's about division and subtraction, we struggle. So be positive, fight the good fight, be a happy warrior.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. There are two books that I recommend for everybody out there. One is Frank Luntz's Words That Work. The second one is Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, What Separates Good People from Politics and Religion. And I think if we were more educated and the communications tactics, we would be more effective in our ideas, certainly. Speaking of ideas, John Bird asked a question. He said, thoughts on improving broadband mapping and rural broadband infrastructure development? And I know that's a big issue in South Dakota.
Well, and it's my area of expertise. I mean, before joining Congress, I spent years as a co-owner and vice president of a company called Vantage Point Solutions. We did rural telecom engineering and consulting. We had about 250 employees, and we did business in about 40 states. And we designed and built 8,000 miles of fiber optic network every single year. And I was the vice president of consulting and helped companies figure out how to cash flow these systems and how to run good networks. And yeah, broadband mapping, critically important. In the last 5 years, so many companies have really, really improved their ability at a very granular level, at the location by location level. In fact, I helped to design and deploy speed testing systems with Raspberry Pis, these tiny microcomputers that can be put into a home as part of a telecom system to provide real-time data on things like latency, lag, ping, throughput, and that is giving our country a tremendous amount of data about our speeds and just overall our quality. We are to a degree that we are not doing a very good job of acknowledging. We are every single month doing a better job of sticking investment into rural broadband and broadband mapping, and it is paying dividends.
Excellent, excellent. Well, that is very helpful. We've got just a couple more minutes of your time here real quick, and I need to ask you the important question of the day. There's no way around it. Packers or Vikings?
Vikings. This is not even a choice. Listen, I know the Packers have won more Super Bowls. I know there are more happy days as a Packers fan than there are as a Vikings fan. But at some point, my job is not to be a bandwagon rider. My job is to root for the home team and Skol Vikings.
Excellent. And we will have a football season, right? Please tell me yes.
Well, we're going to see.
Well, we're going to let you have the last word. Do you have, for any of our folks that are listening, do you have any words of advice, thoughts on this fall and how they can get involved and stay engaged?
Well, I said it before, but I will repeat it. Be a happy warrior and do not lose the faith. Do not lose the faith, because this country is still the greatest country in the history of the world. It is still worth fighting for. And there will be days when things look bleak. There will be days where each of us will wonder if our efforts matter. But the politics of governing this nation, this is not a reality TV show. We don't root for one team over the other because this is tribal or because we're just trying to vote somebody off the island. This is actually about governing a nation and about trying to deliver 330 million people the best access to opportunity. And this matters. And I don't know how many Senate seats or how many House seats we're going to win or lose in November. And I don't know how close the presidential race will be. But what I do know is that we will be more likely to seize victory if we're all engaged. And so often within the conservative movement, we have more fun fighting with one another because family fights can be more fun. Well, Famir, we know the people. And there is time. I'm not anti-primary. Primaries can speak. That is where you get to decide what the soul and the future of the party will look like. I'm not against primaries. But I would say right now, as we move toward November, if you're a conservative, I think you need to be engaged. You need to volunteer. You need to make phone calls. You need to write those $15 checks. And you need to keep the faith. This matters.
Well, we certainly appreciate you fighting for our values in Washington, D.C. and South Dakota, certainly. I know it's not easy. I was watching some of the votes and amendments this weekend on the transportation bill. And I'll tell you, you and your staff are doing a tremendous job just being able to communicate with constituents and get ideas out there, because you've been on with us for about 40 minutes. I think, as I watch these members try to communicate via a conference call, wow, that's tough. There's a lot of challenges.
This is the stuff that's worth doing.
Thank you so much for your time, Congressman Johnson. I really appreciate it. It's great,
Robert,
seeing you again, and you have a wonderful weekend.
Absolutely, anytime. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye. All right, folks, that concludes today's portion of the webinar with Congressman Dusty Johnson from South Dakota. If you would like to know more about Congressman Johnson and the great work he's doing, you can follow him on Facebook. You can also go to his congressional website and learn more about him. We are going to continue with our series of teletown halls in the weeks to come. We're currently recruiting various other political and thought leaders across the country, and we certainly appreciate you coming and listening to us. If you have any more thoughts or questions, you can reach us at leadershipinstitute.org, or you can email one of our team on the website. Thank you very much and have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks so much for watching this video. To watch our latest video, click here. And to make sure you don't miss any future videos, be sure to subscribe.